We have ourselves a new defender, so I figure I should make a video about this, right? Hey everyone, Derpy here, and welcome back to another Battle Pirates video. This is not necessarily giving you a build for this hole. This is me going over some conversations I had on Discord and the Kicksite forums with various people, including the Kicksite designer for this thing, how this thing works before we get a chance to see it in the game live, because I'm sure we'll be in some of the Kicksite employee bases. I'm not going to give you a 100% hard out, fast finished build. I'm going to give you some ideas and things to work with, in particular things that won't work for this thing. First of all, let's talk about the use of this hole. This is a tier 9 defender and has a ton of armor points. It also has about 100,000 of each deflection, so it's going to take a while for this thing to get sunk by trenchers, hellswarms, and warhounds. It's going to stay alive 1, 2, 3 minutes throughout the entire battle, and its purpose is not to deal damage, its purpose is to debuff the enemy hull. And it does this in two different ways. The first is the weapon you're going to equip to the hull, which is called the Forge Fire Thrower, and the second is the built-in weapon called the Permafrost Cannon. Let's talk about the Permafrost Cannon first. This thing has a damage that's very small. At least at the start of the battle, this won't do anything. Maybe towards the end with more nuanced builds, it could do more if you increase ballistic damage, but that's not the main goal of this hull. It has a reload time of 8 seconds and will apply a 4-second splash, which can be reduced if the enemy trencher, warhound, hellswarm, etc. has some slow reduction, slow resit, which most hulls do have, that reduces the time that the hull is slowed. This weapon, this Permafrost Cannon, is also splash-based, and that means that accuracy doesn't matter, and it can hit multiple things at once if you are stacked, which is great. It also does have a range of 45, which will be important, and the slow effect is 25%. Now the second weapon here is the Forge Fire Thrower, which I'm just going to go ahead and throw on. You should get this. It works very nicely with this hull, and I'm not sure how nicely it will work with other ones, but this is a really nice one to actually use here. It is limited to only this hull in particular, so you can't even put it on Houndmaster if you wanted to, which, I'm not the biggest fan of, but whatever. Now, these two things are not going to deal damage, they're going to debuff the enemy hull and make it weaker by first slowing it down, which we saw in a Permafrost Cannon, and secondly, from this weapon, which reduces the deflections of everything. At the maximum, even if you have 2, 3, 4 of these in your base at some point, it's going to reduce the deflections by still that same maximum there with the given number per hit. So for example, every hit here with ballistic is negative 200 deflection on the Warhound, for example, up to a maximum of negative 300,000 deflection. Now this is very, very powerful because in essence, it makes all your turrets stronger as the battle continues, because the enemy hull, your enemy trench, your enemy Warhound, enemy Hellswarm, its armor, its deflection is getting weaker. So this is a really interesting mechanic and is something that I'm pretty excited about. Now, let's talk about reload. What you'll see here is that the Forge Fire Thrower has a reload time of 0.2 seconds. This is the minimum reload time anything in the entire game will fire at. You cannot produce this reload time at all. Radioactive reload specials, thrower reload specials are completely useless and won't work on this thing. Do not put radioactive reload on here just because you can. It won't work. I got caught on that mistake at the very beginning. Now let's talk about the reload on the built-in weapon here, the Permafrost Cannon. We're told that this is ballistic and should be affected by specials, but we're also told it is not affected by rank bonuses. That may or may not be true. Most people have enough tokens to rank this thing up anyway, so that may or may not be true. Rank bonuses, we've been told, do not affect this thing. Now the reload here, 8 seconds, can be reduced with ballistic reload specials, which you're going to want to do. Now that we talked about reload, let's talk about range. Notice that both the cannon and the thrower here have a range of 45. If you buff one of them, and say you put on something that boosts ballistic range, such as, for example, the researchable ones, for example here, anything that boosts ballistic range, so Hardened Barrels 3 as an example, if you put this or Nuclear Accelerators 2 or anything on your hull, the ballistic range will increase, but that's going to be bad. Why? Because your ballistic range will now be like 62 and your main thrower range will be like 45. So this hull, if it's chasing something down, it's only going to fire the ballistic and not the radioactive. You do not want to change range whatsoever, which is a mistake that I did fall into with my first design at this hull. Now there is a caveat to this. If you do something that changes both of the ranges at the same amount, you're totally allowed to do that. So for example, putting both ballistic and radioactive scope is okay, although you wouldn't want to do this. What you are going to want to do is probably put on the one special that I'll definitely give you is the Reaver Scout engine. This is because speed is very important. You want to get this combat speed up as high as possible, up to about 65-70, so it can catch warhounds and trenchers if it's chasing these down at all. This is assuming that you have your hole in a position where it needs to chase. If you trap it between a couple of gates inside your base or it's coming out of the base, it doesn't necessarily need to be this fast. So there's an option there. Reaver Scout engine. Now I talked about ranges and how you don't want to change them. It actually is okay to change them as long as you change them both by the same amount. Minus 50% on both of the weapon and the cannon will help, and range doesn't matter for this hole pretty much at all because it can catch up to things really quickly. In fact, against Hellswarms, you probably want a lower range, so it's inside the minimum range, and just shooting them away at them, and they're stacked because all your damage is splash, so it could be really powerful. Other specials that you want to consider are things that increase ballistic reload, and as a look here, look at the researchable tab too, because Autoloaders 3 is really powerful. It does take up a lot of weapon weight, but that doesn't really matter. Ballistic reload is really strong here, so look at something like this. Another special that you could go for is something that increases slow resist, or evade, and stun resistance. And you could have a couple options here. You could go for something like ECM Dampener, which is better in terms of the stun resist, or you could go for Agility System 4, which is better in terms of evade. Pick whichever one you want there in general. And you could also go for Shielded Circuitry if you want to buff evade through another means, such as Hyper 30. If you really wanted to. So consider one of those specials. For example, I'm going to put on Agility System 4 here. Now these last two specials will change a little bit depending on what weapon and what special you run. If you run something else instead of Reaver Scout engine, such as the Onslaught engine, your combat speed will be too low, so you need to buff up the remaining combat speed with these other slots with something like Hyper 30, which something like the Obliteration Launcher special, which will buff combat speed by 35%, or through something like the Insulated Charge Capacitator, which will just buff combat speed by 30%. So you want to consider that, especially if you're not running Reaver Scout engine, doing Obliteration Launchers, or if you don't have that, something like the Insulated Charge Capacitator, or even something else that increases combat speed. Scatter System, just only for the combat speed bonus, is a decent option in my opinion. As an example, I'm going to throw on Obliteration Launcher System. Now this last thought here, you also do have a couple options, and at least what I think. Other people may disagree, whatever. So what I'm going to put on here is just looking through this. Something that you're not buffing right now is Splash. Now most of your weapons, both of your weapons here do insane amounts of splash damage. For some reason it doesn't like it when you search for Splash, so you have to look through it manually. I'm not sure why. But things that do increase splash you could look for are things like the narrow firing aperture, things like viscosity regulator, things like combustion system 2, but by far the best one is the one down here, heavy explosive shells 4 or desolation warheads. You can sort of pick whichever one you want to go for here. There shouldn't be a ton of difference between them. I like the minus 15% spread from desolation warheads and a slightly higher splash, so I'm going to stick that on. As far as armor, you have a couple choices. You can go for something that increases your movement and turn speed and evade, like the D5EV. You could go for something that boosts the stun resist, like the limited D5ST if you wanted to. And you could even go for something like a Tier 8 armor that increases your deflections, which I don't think I'm going to recommend at all. Ballistic Plate 8 will increase your deflection from 100,000 to 120,000, which isn't that great. So I'm not going to go for the build that I'm showing you on screen. I'm going to go for something fairly close to it. And I'm not trying to give you this and saying build this. I'm trying to get you to think about understanding some things. Like, don't mess with the ranges unless it's Reaver Scout engine. Don't mess with reload for the radioactive, because that does nothing. And consider things like speed and splash and ballistic reload as important things, as well as evade. So I hope this video helped. If it did, go ahead and leave a like. If you enjoyed the content, if you enjoy the work I put into it, thank you so much. And as always, this is Derpy, signing out, helping you be a better pirate.